Our program tonight provides an understanding of how evangelical Christianity became the powerful, even dominant force in conservative politics that it is in America today. Our presenter, Doug Smith, is eminently qualified to explain how we got here, as his program's title indicates. He was raised in a conservative evangelical family in the conservative evangelical stronghold that is the western part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. He is a graduate of Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with a degree in business administration, and went on to a 45-year career in evangelical radio broadcasting. He managed KNWS Radio, Life 101.9 in Waterloo, for 19 of those years. He also worked at stations in Michigan and Indiana, and finally, after his time with KNWS, ended his career in North Dakota. Upon his retirement at the end of 2021, Doug and his wife Margie returned to the Cedar Valley. They've been married for 41 years and now are members of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Doug has spoken to the forum twice before tonight. First, back in January 2013 on the topic, The History of Christian Broadcasting. And then again in October of 2016 on the same topic as tonight, how evangelicals ended up as Donald Trump's biggest supporters. He also has served as one of the Canterbury Forum's coordinators. So please join me now in giving Doug Smith a warm welcome and an attentive ear.
Thank you very much. I would, before I launch in here, I would like to thank the Canterbury Steering Committee for inviting me to speak now for this third time, which I think is a record for someone without a PhD. As Bob mentioned in his introduction, I am a product of two worlds. I was raised in fundamentalist churches, went to a Baptist college, and worked for 45 years in Christian radio, including 19 years at Life 101.9 here in the Cedar Valley. There's still an evangelical voice in my head that argues with me sometimes. But now we live in the Episcopal/progressive Christian world, which Margie and I have been a part of since we joined St. Luke's Episcopal Church back several years ago. I'm not sure there are a lot of people who have made that big of a change in their religious views, but I believe it qualifies me to interpret both sides to the other. I am not here tonight to gratuitously insult evangelicals. Evangelicals are my people. I understand that world and speak the language fluently. Some of the people I love most in the world are evangelicals. So when the question of how did we get here comes up, I know because I lived it, or at least a lot of it. My hope in talking about this topic is that somehow I could break through the bubble that they live in and encourage them to rethink what they're doing. Does living a faithful Christian life really require you to try to force American law and culture to bend to your will? Could you maybe consider returning to a more simple and humble faith? A faith that is less about coercion and more about service. It never fails to shock me that some people who I know are loving and kind people who know right from wrong, people who for years have expected the candidates they vote for to be good people whose behavior is above reproach, could abandon their view of themselves as values voters and vote for a candidate who seems to contradict everything that they hold dear. That's really what we're here to try to figure out. How did evangelicals get to this point? One last qualifier. I will be using the term evangelicals a lot, rather than the term Christians. This is because the white Protestant evangelical world is a subset of Christianity. Christian is a much broader term, and many people with a wide variety of viewpoints can all claim to be Christians. So instead, I'll be using the term evangelicals or evangelical Christians. I'm not here to critique those in other branches of Christianity. I'll leave that for others. I can only speak to the things that I know firsthand. Now let's see if I can do this properly.
You've got it.
Okay. Let's see. There we go. All right. So how did we get here? How did evangelicals become such a potent force in politics? Why do we care what they think and how they vote? How have they typically voted in the past, and what issues are most important to them? To answer these questions, we need to go back a few years and talk first about the predecessors of today's evangelicals, and those are the fundamentalists. While they are two distinct branches of Protestant Christianity, they are exactly the same in terms of basic theology. But we begin our search for how did we get here even farther back. One of the through lines in my presentation tonight has to do with public schools. After the Civil War, when it was finally legal to teach young Black children to read and write, people in the Jim Crow South did not want Black and white children taught in the same schools. This was also true in areas of the North as well, but in the South, school segregation was mandatory and inviolable. Why? Well, probably lots of reasons, but I can think of two main reasons. First, they didn't want Black children to have the same level of education as the white children, lest they start thinking that they are the equal of whites and try to go to white colleges and get white jobs. And second, they didn't want Black and white children to grow up together lest they become friends and maybe even want to marry each other. So they came up with the legal justification of separate but equal to continue keeping the races apart. Keep this thought in mind about schools and the underlying issue of racism, because we'll come back to this topic again. In the early 20th century, there was a major schism taking place within many Protestant denominations in America. It was a reaction to new discoveries in science and theology. Darwin's theory of evolution was causing people to rethink the way they interpreted the first few chapters of Genesis. Many Protestant denominations divided into two groups: those who believed that doctrines should be amended to accommodate these new scientific discoveries, and those who rejected Darwin in favor of the traditional understanding and interpretation of the Bible. These two groups became known as modernists and fundamentalists. In addition to evolution, there were new ways of studying and interpreting the texts of the Bible. In the 19th century, European scholars began studying the Bible with the same kinds of methods that they used to study other ancient texts. This method became known as historical critical scholarship. During this time, some scholars began teaching about the Bible in ways that contradicted traditional understandings. Again, these findings rocked the church world, and it became another fault line between the modernists and the fundamentalists. Fundamentalists took their name from a series of essays written between 1910 and 1915 called The Fundamentals. It was a set of 90 essays by 64 different authors and addressed the topics of evolution, higher criticism, the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the inspiration of the Bible, the second coming of Christ, and other doctrinal beliefs that conservative theologians believed were under attack. These sets of essays were sent free of charge, thanks to Lyman Stewart, the founder of the Union Oil Company, and his brother Milton Stewart, to churches around the country, as well as to religious colleges and seminaries, and to Protestant religious workers in every English-speaking country. It was a reaction, a pushback against change and modernity. Many of the Protestant denominations of the time experienced battles for control, and many of them eventually split. There were a number of new religious colleges and seminaries established in the early years of the 20th century by various fundamentalist groups trying to counter what they saw as heretical teaching in mainline Protestant seminaries. The high water mark in this battle was in 1925 in the court case known as the State of Tennessee versus John Scopes, which is now better known as the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes was a public school teacher who taught evolution to his students in opposition to a law in Tennessee at the time, which forbade teaching evolution. Scopes was eventually found guilty, but the verdict was overturned on a technicality. Despite the guilty verdict, in the court of public opinion, fundamentalism had been humiliated. In the wake of the trial, fundamentalists withdrew from politics and culture and concentrated on building their own infrastructure, such as book and magazine publishers, mission societies, radio programs, and more. Even hymnals all took off as the fundamentalist world grew, but pretty much out of sight of mainstream culture. In fact, the term separate or separatist became part of the lexicon of fundamentalism. It was also during this time that fundamentalism began to take on characteristics of political conservatism. According to the book A Family of Faith by Timothy Phillips and Dennis Alcombe, there was a great reversal that took place in the early part of the 20th century. As late as the 19th century, many churches tended to have the eschatological perspective of postmillennialism. Simply put, they believed that Christians would eventually evangelize the entire world, which would lead to 1,000 years of peace and tranquility. And the second coming of Christ would occur at the end of this period of 1,000 years. So the role of believers was to help people better themselves, clearing slums, attacking vice, setting up orphanages, starting hospitals, in general, doing good, which tended to make them lean to the liberal side of the equation politically in their efforts to use political means to promote the betterment of society. However, as fundamentalism began to emerge in the early 20th century, it tended toward a different perspective on the end times. Since the modernists were holding on to the post-millennial position, fundamentalists decided to embrace a new view of eschatology called dispensationalism, which has as its centerpiece a new concept called the premillennial rapture of the church. It was first developed and promoted by John Nelson Darby, a clergyman in England and Ireland in the mid-1800s. Dispensationalism divides up human history into 7 ages or dispensations, the current one being the 6th, the age of grace or the church age. This dispensation is supposed to come to a close with the rapture or removing of the true believers, and then the judgment of God will be poured out on the people left behind in the form of the Great Tribulation. This, in turn, is ended after 7 years by the second coming of Jesus, who defeats the forces of evil and sets up his millennial kingdom on earth, which is the 7th and final dispensation. Now, within the fundamentalist world, this pessimistic view helped them to explain PR disasters like the Scopes monkey trial. It reinforced the notion that things were getting worse and worse for the true believers, so the rapture can't be far behind. The great reversal happened as many churches and denominations forgot their predecessors' concern for the welfare of society and instead focused their attention on personal piety, converting others to the true faith, and being ready for the rapture. So progressive social concern, especially when connected to liberal politics, became suspect among fundamentalists. But it would still be decades before this would emerge as political action. The term evangelical, as we understand it today, didn't emerge until after World War II. Fundamentalism itself began fragmenting in the mid-1930s, with more moderate fundamentalists beginning to part company with the more militant branch. The disagreement developed over how believers should respond to an unbelieving world. The moderate group believed they needed to engage the culture directly and stop being so strident, argumentative, and separatist. The basic doctrines didn't change, but they wanted to interact more with the world around them to project a more positive image. And they wanted to apply their faith to political, social, and economic areas as well. This new evangelical movement spurred the development of new colleges and seminaries and other religious institutions, just like the fundamentalists had done a generation earlier. My own alma mater, Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was founded in 1947 as a part of this movement. This is what the campus looked like when I started in 1974, when it was called Grand Rapids Baptist College. The biggest name associated with this new evangelical movement was a young preacher named Billy Graham. Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, was also in the early forefront of evangelical Christianity. The magazine Christianity Today got its start in the 1950s, becoming a leading evangelical voice that is still strong today. As you might imagine, there was and still is friction between those who remained firmly in the fundamentalist camp and those who preferred to identify as evangelical. But in spite of the sniping back and forth, they really are very similar from a doctrinal perspective. In 1954, the Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education formally desegregated public schools. In response, white churches throughout the South started their own church-run private schools, sometimes referred to as segregation academies. Remember what I mentioned earlier about how schools are a key to understanding how we got here. Since these academies were owned by churches, which are legally defined as charitable institutions, the schools were also considered to be tax exempt. By the way, the Protestant Christian schools of today in both the North and the South are the direct descendants of these segregation academies. Not that they overtly keep minorities out, but the tuition price is set high enough so that the vast majority of students come from prosperous white families. If you wonder about a Protestant Christian school near you, check the date that it started. If it was founded after 1954, it's possible that its original purpose was to be a haven for white kids and their families. Also, in case you're wondering why Protestant Christian schools were not really a thing before 1954, it's because the white public schools were Protestant Christian schools. A quasi-religious group, the John Birch Society, began in 1958. It was not a fundamentalist organization, but there were many fundamentalists among their members and donors. They advocated for the impeachment of Chief Justice Earl Warren regarding the Brown v. Board of Education decision because they opposed integrated schools. They also opposed big government, communism, globalism, welfare, the civil rights movement, the United Nations, and they were very much into conspiracy theories. Some have called the John Birch Society a bridge between McCarthyism and the moral majority. At the time, they were considered an extremist fringe group, but we hear strong echoes of their rhetoric in today's Republican Party. Their founder, Robert Welch, called his group God's Angry Men. Essentially, what they added to this issue was to normalize inflammatory right-wing rhetoric. Moving into the 1960s, we had two decisions by the Supreme Court regarding mandatory verbal prayer in schools and Bible reading in public schools. I remember in my kindergarten class at the beginning of each school day in the early 60s, we would recite both the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer. But when I moved on to the first grade, we stopped saying the prayer. At the time, I didn't understand why, and nobody explained it to us. But that issue became a cause célèbre in Christian circles, with people claiming that the government had kicked God out of the schools. The school prayer issue, combined with the teaching of evolution in public schools, became the reason many churches used to justify their Christian schools. As we move into the 70s, here's where you can see the beginnings of what we now recognize as the religious right. And much of what follows comes from my own memories of the time. I was in high school in the early 70s, and in 1974 began my college education at what was then known as Grand Rapids Baptist College. Having grown up in this environment, I was aware of what was considered important, and I fully bought into all of it. One question that I can definitively answer from my own experience is the question, did the religious right begin in 1973? You might be thinking, well, 1973 was the Roe v. Wade decision. Isn't that the beginning of the religious right? That is not correct. Throughout my college years, 1974 to 1978, I don't remember any mention of the abortion ruling or how Christians ought to react to it. Now, if that had been a thing in evangelical circles, you can be sure that we Christian college students would have been the first to hear about it and be mobilized into action. Instead, here's what really happened. On June 30th, 1971, the US Supreme Court issued a ruling that denied tax-exempt status to any charitable institution that engages in overt racial discrimination. This meant that schools would have to pay taxes, and donations to these schools would not qualify as tax-deductible contributions for the donors. So the Internal Revenue Service began sending questionnaires to Christian schools and colleges, including Jerry Falwell's Lynchburg Christian Schools, now known as Liberty University, and Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, which is still a leading fundamentalist institution. Now, of course, they had to acknowledge that they did not admit African American students, but they decided to frame it as a religious freedom issue instead, rather than a racial segregation issue. In the case of Bob Jones, they tried to placate the IRS by admitting some African American students, but putting in place a policy that forbade interracial dating and marriage. The IRS wasn't having it, and in 1976, they rescinded the school's tax-exempt status. This was the trigger for the formation of the religious right. Never forget, defending racial segregation in their private Christian schools was the foundation, the starting point for everything that came after. Now, as you can imagine, Christian leaders throughout the South and the Christian conservatives in general were enraged. They interpreted this as the government turning against Christians, and specifically Christian schools. The architect of the religious right, Paul Weyrich, who went on to become a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, emphatically denied that opposition to abortion played any role in the beginning stages of the religious right. He said, quote, "What caused the movement to surface was the federal government's moves against Christian schools," end quote. Now, in 1973, there were two important developments that have a bearing on the formation of the religious right. Obviously, the Roe v. Wade decision released on January 22nd, 1973 was important, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But something else happened in 1973. A theologian named Rousas Rushdoony published a book called The Institutes of Biblical Law. In it, he proposed that God's law, as revealed in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, and as interpreted by himself, should be the standard and authority for civil law and government. In other words, a theocracy in which the civil government is guided directly by the laws found in the Bible. Religious and political authorities would be closely intertwined, with civil law derived explicitly from biblical teachings. You know, the same way Sharia law works with Islam. Rushdoony's theory became known by several names: Christian Reconstructionism, Dominion theology, and today we know it as Christian nationalism. But at the time, although it did get some press, it wasn't generally known outside of academic and theological circles. One person who did pay attention to it was Paul Weyrich. Now, he denied that he favored establishing a theocracy in America, but clearly many of the arguments made in the book found their way into the messaging of the religious right. It's only been in recent years, mainly since the rise of Donald Trump, that we've come back to Rushdoony and his political views. So we'll circle back on this later. The big news in 1973 was the abortion decision, but it did not lead to the formation of the religious right. Most evangelical churches and pastors didn't react to it at all, and those who did were rather restrained. The Southern Baptist Convention expressed support for laws liberalizing abortion access. W.A. Criswell, pastor of the influential First Baptist Church of Dallas, expressed support for the Supreme Court's decision in Roe, taking the traditional theological position that life begins at birth, not conception. The Southern Baptists did not adopt a pro-life stance until 1980. The Roman Catholic Church in the U.S. did react immediately in 1973, but it was 6 more years, 1979, before abortion became a political flashpoint for evangelicals. Jerry Falwell's first sermon about the abortion issue didn't come until 1978. So now we come to 1979, and this is the part that infuriates me personally. It was 1979, not 1973, that the moral majority was founded and the religious right was born. As I said, I lived in the conservative evangelical world throughout that time, and it was decades before I realized how I and most other people I know were manipulated back in 1979. Now, I was aware of the tax battle that Bob Jones lost, but I didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. In fact, when I learned what I'm about to relate to you, I Googled all of these dates to see if they were correct, and I discovered the extent to which I had been deceived. The fury of these evangelical leaders over their inability to segregate their schools led them to try to find a way to get the great masses of evangelicals in the pews motivated to join in their fight against the federal government and to vote the way they wanted them to. Could they be motivated to vote to prop up school segregation? No, not in 1979. So they had to pick another topic. What issue had the power to stir people emotionally? A catalyst that was so strong it would affect how people voted. In discussions among evangelical leaders at the time, they came to believe that the issue of abortion had the potential to galvanize conservative religious voters to vote their way. As they planned their strategy, Paul Weyrich coined the phrase the moral majority and began the work of undermining the trust of evangelical Christians in our system of government. So the deception was they told us it was about ending abortion, but their main motivating issue was not abortion. It was really about segregated schools. It was about race. Dividing society on abortion, however, would have the same net effect for them. For the benefit of those who are genuinely opposed to abortion as a moral issue, I agree. It's not an easy issue. There are profound ramifications to it. Many Christians disagree on when life begins and what the Bible has to say about it. No one, certainly not me, would say that a person is wrong to feel this way or that you should change your mind or your convictions on this issue. If you believe abortion is wrong, don't get an abortion. What I'm saying is, all you have to do is live out your convictions. You don't have to vote to force everyone else to live out your convictions. It is also sad to reflect on the fact that to focus all this attention on abortion, which is never mentioned in the Bible, by the way, took away from all the things that actually are mentioned in the Bible. Things like helping the poor, the hungry, the sick, the homeless, loving your neighbor as yourself. But I guess there's no fame or power or money in fighting poverty, hunger, or homelessness. This fixation on abortion also hurt the cause of evangelism itself. If you're trying to spread the gospel and turn America back to God, it doesn't help your cause to spend all of your time and energy and money on taking rights away from people. It's clear, no matter whose data you look at, that membership in evangelical churches is declining rather rapidly. The number one religious classification in America today, the nones. That's N-O-N-E-S. In 1979, this new moral majority began to educate evangelicals on why they should believe that abortion is wrong. In 1979, an author and theologian named Francis Schaeffer and a surgeon named Dr. C. Everett Koop teamed up to do a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. This series and its accompanying book put abortion unquestionably on the front burner of evangelical concern. Schaeffer and Koop had to convince evangelicals that abortion should not just be a Catholic issue. This film series was not intended for theatrical release or television. It was designed to be shown in smaller settings. These films were shown extensively in churches throughout the country, as well as Christian colleges and seminaries. And they slowly started convincing the evangelical rank and file that legalized abortion was a sin, and the Roe v. Wade decision had to be overturned, or God would punish America. This issue was incorporated into the Republican Party platform in 1980. In the run-up to the 1980 election, Falwell, Weyrich, and others argued that the godly choice was not Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist school teacher, Sunday school teacher, and fellow evangelical, but a divorced and remarried Hollywood actor who had no evangelical bona fides, Ronald Reagan. Carter's Christianity led him to do justice, seek peace, and fight racism. But that's not what evangelicals wanted in 1980. The leaders in the evangelical world wanted power and access to power so they could continue their battle against the federal government and school integration. Abortion was a decoy. We were played for the greater glory of Jerry Falwell, James Dobson, Francis Schaeffer, Paul Weyrich, Pat Robertson, Richard Viguerie, and many others. I only learned the details of this within the past 15 years, and that's why I feel betrayed and taken advantage of. Yet, not everyone who learns about this has the same reaction as I did. It reminds me of a quote attributed to Mark Twain. It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. Most evangelicals dismiss this or deny it, rather than admit that they've wasted decades and untold amounts of money trying to fight this battle. With Reagan in the presidency starting in 1981, a number of things began to go the way the moral majority wanted. That organization itself faded out by the end of the 1980s, but in its place was a different organization, one I'll bet you've never heard of. It's called the Council for National Policy. It began in 1981, and from that time to this has operated in secrecy. Only a few media leaks over the years have revealed their strictly confidential membership lists. A few of the past and current members include Tim LaHaye, author of the Left Behind books, Paul Weyrich, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Phyllis Schlafly, James Dobson, Trent Lott, John Ashcroft, Oliver North, Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, Leonard Leo, and Virginia Thomas. Gathered under its umbrella are the following organizations: the Christian Coalition, the Heritage Foundation, the Family Research Council, Tea Party Patriots, Faith and Freedom Coalition, the Koch brothers, Turning Point Action, and much more. Over the years, these individuals, organizations, and their extremely wealthy donors have coordinated a long-term strategy for turning this country into a religious autocracy. Their goal is not to reform government. Their goal is to destroy what is now standing and replace it with a government designed by and for them, and create the Christian nation they've always wanted. One notable decision made during the Reagan years that still has major ramifications today is the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine had been in place since 1949, and it said that all broadcasters had the responsibility to present controversial issues of public importance, and to do so in a manner that fairly reflected differing viewpoints. If one side of an issue gets airtime, the other side must get equal time to share their views. In 1987, that rule was killed by Reagan appointees on the FCC. It was this decision that began the career of Rush Limbaugh in the 1980s and others like him, who could spout any opinions they wanted to without having to give opponents equal time. And in the mid-1990s, it led to the beginnings of Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch and run by Roger Ailes, a former media advisor for Reagan. The operation of radio and TV outlets who are not tethered to the Fairness Doctrine, or tethered to the truth for that matter, are a key reason for the division that we're experiencing in our country today. As presidential candidates campaigned for the Republican nomination from 1988 on, they had to voice their support for ending abortion. Primary voters were looking for any candidate who sounded as evangelical as possible, people who believed just like they did. From then on, candidates such as Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan, George W. Bush, Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, Michelle Bachmann, Ted Cruz, Mike Pence, Sarah Palin, and many others have wooed voters to their cause by giving their Christian testimony in language that evangelicals wanted to hear. Now, I'm not suggesting that they were being disingenuous or hypocritical in doing so. I'm saying that when you make evangelical beliefs the litmus test to receive the votes of massive numbers of people, guess what you're going to get? Lots of people who will say what you want to hear. What Republicans came to discover over the past 40 plus years is that they did not use evangelicals to gain power. Evangelicals used the Republican Party as a way to gain power for themselves. Republicans didn't get the army of foot soldiers they thought they were getting. They got an army of generals, all looking for ways to take charge. At this point in our history, I would venture to say that no Republican can be elected president without the enthusiastic backing of the evangelical church behind them. The Republican establishment tried to keep the whip hand. Their nominees in 1992 and 1996, George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, both lost, in part because evangelicals were not sufficiently convinced of their commitment to the abortion issue. They did get the majority of evangelical votes, but not their enthusiastic endorsement. In 2000 and 2004, evangelicals did get the candidate they wanted in George W. Bush. But again, he disappointed the faithful by not bringing an anti-abortion amendment to Congress. Now, as we know, the Bush years were largely consumed with the aftermath of 9/11 and prosecuting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were firmly supported by evangelicals in spite of not even attempting to meet the criteria for just war. So the evangelical church added another issue to its long list of fears. Now we all had to be fearful of Muslims. The use of fear as a motivation for evangelical political action is, however, the one constant. They continued to be just as consumed by fear and anger in the 2004 election as they had been 25 years earlier at the founding of the religious right. In the elections of 2008 and 2012, the Republican establishment got behind candidates who, again, were not the wholehearted favorites of the evangelical wing of the party, and both lost. John McCain was a bona fide war hero, but he lacked sufficient enthusiasm on the topics of abortion and same-sex marriage. Mitt Romney was a successful governor and a successful businessman, but he was perceived as too moderate. Both McCain and Romney received a majority of the votes of evangelicals, but neither got the grassroots enthusiasm that they needed to defeat Barack Obama. With the election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama, in 2008, another fear-based movement began called the Tea Party. It began with a rally in Washington, D.C., protesting the tax increases that hadn't even been thought of yet or proposed. The assumption was that with a Democrat in the White House, massive tax increases must be right around the corner. This movement was enthusiastically embraced by evangelicals. But the Tea Party soon came to be a catch-all term that included not only cutting taxes, but also expanding gun rights, eliminating regulations, preventing healthcare expansion, and denying climate change, all of which had the effect of pushing the Republican Party even further to the right. The undercurrent was that of racism, appalled that their country had elected an African American as president. In the 2010 election, many moderate Republicans were primaried out of office as the effort to purify the party gained strength. They wanted only those who were committed to this vision of a Christian nation to hold office. Those who were committed to actually governing and being willing to compromise in order to solve problems for their constituents were pushed out as being insufficiently Republican. They were called rhinos, Republican in name only. And in 2010, with the strength and fervor of the Tea Party behind them, Republicans took a commanding majority in the House and narrowed the gap between the parties in the Senate. I believe that 2010 was the year evangelicals took control of the party. From then on, the Republican establishment was fighting a rearguard action to keep from being entirely overwhelmed by the evangelicals. Now, several notable things happened in 2010 that fixed that year in my mind. When Senator Chuck Grassley accused President Obama's healthcare legislation as setting up death panels, a phrase popularized by Sarah Palin, I knew we'd lost him. No longer a principled conservative, he'd cast his lot in with the Tea Party. Another event in 2010 was the backlash here in Iowa against the state Supreme Court, who had ruled unanimously in 2009 in the Varnum decision that same-sex marriage was protected by the Iowa Constitution. A massive campaign was launched by a conservative evangelical group here in Iowa called the Family Leader against the three members of the court who were up for a retention vote in 2010. Led by the organization's founder, Bob Vanderplatz, they were successful in unseating all three justices. And the final thing that made the year 2010 memorable from a personal point of view, that's when my wife Margie and I finally left the evangelical world and joined St. Luke's Episcopal Church. During the Obama years, evangelicals vilified him for pushing the Affordable Care Act through Congress, bringing 45 million more Americans health insurance coverage. As I watched the arguments go back and forth during those years, I sadly concluded that only countries that are racially homogenous can muster the political will to actually cover all of their citizens with health care or the other social safety net programs. Once you have a multi-ethnic country, the dominant race will refuse to take care of them. We're not spending our money on those people. The truth is, it's the people who view minorities as lazy or greedy who prevent this country from helping our most vulnerable citizens. Essentially, preventing us from doing what Jesus told us to do in Matthew 25, feeding the hungry, providing clean water for the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the needy, looking after the sick, and visiting prisoners. Now, evangelicals will say that they do those things as individuals and churches, but that God never commanded governments to redistribute money to carry this out. To that, I say that what we do as a government is a reflection of us as individuals, we the people. The task is monumental. It's far too big for any individual person or church, no matter how wealthy. We all, as a nation, need to work together to solve these seemingly intractable problems, and yet we don't. So anyway, on with our sad story. Enter Donald Trump, coming down the escalator in 2015 to announce his candidacy for president, kicking it off with a racist diatribe against Mexicans, and following that up a month later, calling for a total ban on Muslim immigrants. He was the first presidential candidate that evangelicals enthusiastically supported in spite of the obvious lack of any religious piety or rhetoric. They supported him because he pandered to them. Remember that word, pandered. He told them exactly what they wanted to hear, that he would only appoint pro-life justices to the Supreme Court and many lower federal courts, appointees vetted and recommended by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. Remember when I said that the Council for National Policy doesn't want to reform government? They want to destroy it and replace it? Well, Donald Trump was their wrecking ball, and still is. Donald Trump would never have had a chance of winning had it not been for the organizing efforts of the Council for National Policy, their affiliated organizations, their ultra-wealthy donors, and the millions of evangelicals who cast their votes for him. Over 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump in both 2016 and 2020, and this year will be no different. With the Trump victory in 2016, Christian nationalism began to take shape as a viable political option. Remember how it was just a fringe idea back in 1973 with only a few adherents who took it seriously? Well, with someone in the White House who seemed more than willing to pander to them, evangelicals began to look seriously at what they might be able to accomplish. Of course, Christian nationalism is not commanded or justified by the Bible. Nowhere is the Christian believer told to change their culture or prevent anyone from doing anything. We are told to cultivate the fruits of the Spirit, and we are told to live in community with love as our guide. Belligerently insisting on getting our way is antithetical to the golden rule and everything taught by Jesus. But that has not stopped our friendly neighborhood theocrats. Theocracy, literally rule by God, is what evangelicals have been planning for and voting for since 1979, me included for many of those years. Of course, it's not really God who would be ruling, is it? It would be the people who claim to speak for him who would be setting the rules. Ironically, the topic of abortion is itself proof that a true theocracy cannot be established. The people who are claiming to speak for God have taken a concept not found in the Bible, abortion, and elevated it to the status of Holy Writ, because it was politically expedient for them to do so. To insist on obedience to a law that is not found in Scripture illustrates that all of these so-called laws of God are only interpretations of what someone wants God's law to be. And with hundreds of distinct denominations in America, who gets to choose? Whose rules prevail? Christians can't even agree amongst themselves, let alone chart a course for the country. For the moment, though, God's law is whatever the Council for National Policy says it is. Maybe we should call their current leader the Ayatollah. By the way, I tried to find out who their current leader is, but that information is not readily available. By the way, here's something you may have wondered about. Why do rank and file evangelicals become so adamant about making everyone else behave the way they want them to? Why would they want to force everyone to obey their rules on abortion, same-sex marriage, transgender rights, and so forth? Because they believe God will bring judgment on America. Pastors and Bible teachers have been thundering for years that God will judge America in the same way we read about Israel being judged by God in the Old Testament. They don't want to get caught in God's crossfire. They, of course, believe it's fine for God to judge those sinners, but leave us righteous people alone. We heard this kind of rhetoric after 9/11 from many popular preachers, including the station that I was managing at the time, that this was God's punishment on America because of abortion and the gays. We also hear it after catastrophic earthquakes and hurricanes, that this is God's judgment. So they not only bind their followers to these rules, they insist that everyone else follow them as well to keep the wrath of God at bay. And again, not a command ever given to Christians in the Bible. Christian nationalism calls for domination of 7 areas of life in America. They sometimes refer to this as the 7 Mountains Mandate. They are family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. Family, patriarchal in structure, of course. Religion, conservative evangelical Christianity, of course. Education, increase the influence of Christian schools so that what is taught can be kept under their control. Media, Fox News, other conservative cable networks, far-right websites, and so on should be protected and encouraged. Entertainment, sanitizing it of sinful elements, movies and TV shows with religious themes. Ever heard of The Chosen? Business, use the wealth capitalism brings to make bigger campaign contributions to politicians. No more regulations, those could harm profits. Elect politicians who will enforce conformity through laws, rules, and regulations based on their interpretation of the Bible. There are actually prayer calendars that revolve around these 7 mountains, with an encouragement for every Christian to pick at least one of these mountains as their own special prayer focus. Their belief is that as evangelical Christians gain control of these 7 areas in our country, we will finally become a Christian nation. Theocracy was put on hold by the 2020 election, which was won by Joe Biden, 306 electoral college votes to 232 for Donald Trump. This outcome was not accepted as fact by Trump. And because he claimed the election was stolen, millions of Americans believed him rather than their own eyes, which brings us to January 6th. The metaphorical Rubicon was crossed in America on January 6th, 2021, when Trump and many GOP members of Congress refused to certify the will of the voters, bringing our American republic to the brink of dictatorship. Among those in the forefront of the insurrectionists were evangelicals, who had been radicalized by Trump into attempting an overthrow of a democratic election. There were a shocking number of religious signs and symbols at the insurrection. It's been well documented that Trump has promised evangelicals that dictatorship is coming. This past July, Trump was speaking at an event organized by the conservative evangelical group Turning Point USA, a group allied with the Council for National Policy. Trump said, quote, "Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians." End quote. Author Maya Angelou once wrote, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Over the past few years with Biden as president, Christian nationalism has been percolating along quietly behind the scenes, preparing for what they believe will be the coming Trump presidency. It's no secret that Trump is not strong on policy, so to be helpful, the Heritage Foundation, a member organization of the Council for National Policy, has come up with their policy proposals that Trump can simply plug and play once he's sworn in. It's called Project 2025. Perhaps you've heard of it. I've heard that Trump is denying knowledge of this, but that's about as credible as the last 3 Supreme Court nominees denying that they wanted to overturn Roe. Project 2025 is designed to implement the 7 Mountains Mandate. This brings us back full circle 51 years ago to Rousas Rushdoony in 1973 in the publication of his Institutes of Biblical Law. Here are the 4 promises of Project 2025. Restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. Dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. Secure our God-given liberty, our God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. Now, this is clear Christian nationalist language. They want to enforce their definition of a biblically based marriage and all reproductive rights for women, including IVF, allow employers to deny health coverage for contraception, dismantle all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, eliminate federal protections for LGBTQ rights, gut the civil service, weaken public education, and lots more. Everyone should Google Project 2025 for themselves and read about what evangelicals are going to be pushing into law if Trump wins the election. Now, Project 2025 is not only about policy, they are also training an army of future appointees for federal positions who will take over for the traditional nonpartisan civil service, many of whom will be fired for being part of the deep state. ProPublica has reported on training videos that they've seen where new would-be theocrats are taught how to avoid embarrassing Freedom of Information Act requests, how to downplay climate change science, how to eradicate gender identity issues, among many other things. This also includes limiting voter access, making it harder for some people to vote. Voter suppression is already going on in several states and would become even worse under a second Trump administration. In the book, The Flag and the Cross, authors Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry wrote, quote, even after accounting for partisanship and political ideology, the more strongly white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, the more likely they were to believe that voting access should be restricted even more, end quote. And of course, voting restrictions have the greatest effect on minorities and the most marginalized populations. And here in 2024, we've come full circle back to the issue of schools. As I said earlier, ever since it became legal to teach Black children, white people have done their very best to keep Black and white children apart. Separate but equal gave way to segregation academies, which morphed into Christian schools. Now, in Iowa and many other states around the country, state tax money has begun flowing to these private Christian schools, ostensibly to provide school choice for parents. Well, naturally, these schools and churches that run them have increased the tuition price. They're approximately 25% higher than they were just 2 years ago, high enough so that the amount coming from the state still won't cover the full cost of a student attending, which means only the people who could already afford the cost of private school will be able to pay the higher prices. And who are they? For the most part, affluent white families. According to Project 2025 from our friends at the Heritage Foundation, all 50 states should be permitted to use taxpayer money to fund these private Christian schools. It's still about schools. Is it about race too? Well, not necessarily. About 17% of Iowa private school students are minorities, a statistic that includes Catholic and non-religion-based private schools, compared to about 25% of minority students in public schools. But it's important to remember that most private Protestant Christian schools in this country began after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and to remember that the religious right movement that started in 1979 was motivated primarily by keeping white and Black students separate. So now these are the schools we're giving our tax money to? Yes, private Christian schools have always had a right to exist and to operate according to the doctrines of their sponsoring churches. And up till now, they have done so as ministries of their church, funded by tuition and free will donations. That's the way it should be, not lining up at the trough for our tax dollars. Call me crazy, But it seems like the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment would prevent taxpayer funds from going to religious organizations, but what do I know? Now, does everyone who identifies as an evangelical feel the need to dominate everything in the country? No. Hashtag not all evangelicals. Just like not all Republicans are Trump supporters, not all evangelicals are Christian nationalists. How can you tell the difference? If a person uses their beliefs on abortion or same-sex marriage or any religion-based belief as their main or sole qualification as to who they vote for, then they are a Christian nationalist. The baseline definition of a Christian nationalist is voting to turn your beliefs about the Bible's laws into civil laws for everyone else. Some evangelicals don't do that, but the vast majority do. I did that for years until fairly recently. If I can change, I believe others can change too. These evangelicals are the bedrock foundation of Trump's base of support. Remember, during the Trump administration, it didn't matter what he said or what he did, he always had about a 41% approval rating, and it hardly ever sank below that. Do you know why? Those were the evangelicals. As long as he kept pandering to them, appointing the judges they wanted, he could not do or say anything that was bad enough for them, the values voters, to stop supporting him. The playbook this year is unchanged. Fear, pandering, and anger. Fear, the liberals are out to get you and your kids. Pandering, Project 2025 is a wish list for evangelicals. And anger, immigrants are coming to take your jobs. These are the things we're hearing now and will continue to hear until Election Day. I believe, this is my own personal opinion, that a vote for Trump is a vote against everything Jesus taught us. Most evangelicals will vote for Trump anyway. Why? Because apparently they haven't read the Gospels. Jesus told us to welcome immigrants, care for the sick, feed the hungry, and he gave us the example to love everyone, including those considered outcasts by our culture. But for Christian nationalists, it's not about compassion or empathy, it's about power. And that is how we got here. An organized, committed, and well-financed group, even if they're only a minority of the population, can take control, even if many of the evangelical rank and file don't even know they're being used for this purpose. And again, this is my opinion, politically active evangelicals are the single most divisive group in America today. Yes, politics has always been divisive and always will be, but by turning political divisions into religious divisions, they have weaponized an already volatile space. When the goal of millions of citizens is to vote for those who will turn their religious beliefs into civil laws, our secular democracy is on dangerous ground. Because they are claiming their candidates are chosen by God and their issues are doing God's will, no compromise is possible. There will be no compromising with the children of darkness. Now, this didn't happen overnight. Evangelical leaders have been playing a very long game since 1979. Some of the movement's founders have since died, and others have taken their place. But this long game for control of our country is still being played, and the only thing that can prevent them from winning is your vote. Now, obviously, I'm not going to make any prediction about the upcoming election, but I must add, even if Trump loses in November, politically active evangelicals aren't going anywhere. Christian nationalism will still be on the march. There will still be countless evangelicals who will continue to sit, soak, and sour in front of Fox News all day. There will still be a Council for National Policy. There will still be a family leader organization in Iowa. Kim Reynolds will still be the governor of Iowa, and they will all be back for more in 2026 and 2028. Those of us who call ourselves Christians and understand the danger of Christian nationalism must continue to be in the forefront of those who oppose it. Looking back over history, there was a time when Christian theology and clergy did control and dominate all of Western civilization, and it lasted for centuries. Today, we refer to that time as the Dark Ages. Let's not go back there. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, Doug. I'm going to stop the recording now and open the floor to questions.